Okay, wonderful. Okay, let's start. So first of all, a happy new year to all of you. Welcome to our first Geneva Impact Talks in 2021. For those who don't know me yet, I'm Marianne Schörling and I have the honor to be moderating our session today. At the Geneva Macro Labs, I'm leading the engagement of stakeholders, building up our community of thought leaders in Geneva and beyond. And being based in Geneva, our Think and Do Tank positioned itself over the last years here in Switzerland to leverage the institutional, the financial, and as well human capital of an international ecosystem where solutions, but as also policies can be formed that change business as usual, and also that inform our agency towards a sustainable tomorrow. So as you might have seen in our upfront promotion of this online session, we are embarking with you now on a new format that puts special emphasis on impact for good. Many of you have joined already one or the other webinar that we have been organizing. And with the impact talks tonight or today, depending on the time, we are offering you now a new or an additional platform to interactively discuss in a fireside chat style a wide range of topics that all allude to concepts and solutions around impact and sustainability. And this goes along with our latest initiative at the Geneva Macro Labs called Geneva Impact. Geneva Impact is co-creating a fast track for actionable projects towards sustainable development. And my colleagues and I, we designed a process where investors and impact experts from private, public and civic sectors join together forces to elaborate impact projects where return on investment goals and sustainability endeavors leverage each other. It is clear global challenges don't know borders. I think we all experienced that last year in 2020, but they require the collaboration of many. And to make impact, we believe at the Geneva Macro Labs that we need execution. And this brings us directly to our today's topic, sustainable business beyond ESG towards an integrated approach. And I would like now to welcome to you our two guest speakers, Kristina Touzenis and Amanda Feldman. Both bring a wealth of experience from their work at international organizations, at the United Nations, but also in the private sector and complement each other when it comes to addressing international standards, concepts, and measures for ESG and sustainability. So we already have seen the slide for Kristina. We can put it back. Kristina Touzenis is an independent advisor. Welcome, Kristina. She is running her own impact consulting firm, helping companies and investors to use sustainability as a business driver. And she's also helping them to effectively operationalize ESG criteria, but also the business and human rights agenda into their strategy. Kristina is also a lawyer and a recognized leader in the business of international human rights standards and principles. And she's also the head of the Geneva chapter of Women in Sustainable Finance. She has more than 20 years of experience in advocacy, human rights reporting, monitoring and evaluating, as well as in policy making and negotiating. At the IOM, the UN Agency for Migration, she served as head of international law, the unit for that, for almost 10 years, and worked before many years as well at the IOM Regional Office for the Mediterranean region. Thank you, Kristina, for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Our second guest is Amanda Feldman. Amanda is the engagement lead on standards for UNDP's Sdg Impact Initiative. She focuses on maximizing impact with funds, policymakers, corporations, and entrepreneurs, bringing experience through various initiatives like Heliotropy, the Impact Management Project, Bridges Fund Management, and Volans. And she serves also as a non-executive board member at Bethnal Green Ventures, reviews monitoring and evaluation of development impact for the Private Infrastructure Development Group, PIDG, and advises on impact with the venture MACE, the Pre-Distribution Initiative and Ocean 14 Capital. Welcome, Amanda, and thank you for joining our community today.
Thanks, Marianne.
So, following the promised fireside chat approach, we will not have short presentation as usual, but we will allow for question and answers right away. We will touch on 3 themes around the question how we can move from ESG considerations to sustainable development goals to more integrated approaches in order to build sustainable business. I invite all of you to engage with the speakers right away, ask your questions or post your comments directly in the chat box, and we will address them as we are moving from one theme to the next. And my colleague, Renate Günther, will co-moderate your engagement as participants. Thank you, Renate, for your moderation. So first, we will look at sustainability strategies in general. We'll discuss the effects of regulations and conclude at the end with the role of impact investment. We have allocated more or less 50 minutes for each theme. Yeah, so I'm very happy now that we can start with the first theme that I just mentioned, sustainability strategies. Kristina and Amanda, it seems as if we are entering a new era. ESG considerations are no longer an option for businesses. They are a must. We hear it now everywhere. While 10 years ago, the groundwork for ESG investing was laid through education and then first government regulations. Very likely now, as we have entered the 2020s, we'll be seeing a new form of commitment and putting ESG into action in such a way that the SDGs are pursued. And it looks like we are now at an important turning point, I would say. It's more, ESG investing is more than just a do-good mentality. And I would like to know now from you where we are standing. Kristina, you said once, I like that phrase, ESG is now part of the alphabet. Investors do have a growing appetite to benchmark companies against each other in terms of their ESG performance. But more importantly, what about their sustainability strategies and indicators? Do you think impact investors have solid indicators in place?
I mean, I'm very conscious about coming from the, what can I say? I don't mean to be pure in any sort of angelic form, but the pure sustainability angle and not the investment angle when I speak to investors or companies. And I think that what I see is that very often, since, as you say, ESG is now very much integral part of the various alphabet soups that we use, that financial experts, investors are seeing that they need to speak sustainability and really address sustainability issues, but that's not their field of expertise. They know how to speak about return on investment. They know how to do a lot of magic with numbers and with investment that I would be absolutely incapable of. But what I often see, and that's the advice that I give, is very often to go in and say, can I have a look at your ESG policy strategy or your sustainability policy strategy? And what I very often get is a document that says something, we work towards the implementation of the SDGs, we do no harm, and we are looking at carbon footprint. That's all very good, but for me, as somebody who has been used to implementing international legal standards in a very practical way around the world, be it from getting people out of detention centers in Libya while I was negotiating with the EU to try to not put them in detention centers in the first place, as well as, you know, supporting Venezuela in a mixed migration crisis, that doesn't tell me very much. So what I really try to say is that there is an international legal framework, which yes, is aimed at states, but at the end of the day is implemented by everybody, be it companies, be it private actors, even if it's the state that has the ultimate responsibility to make these standards respected. Mm-hmm. And that framework is very pragmatic and it's very practical, and it can go into immense detail, for instance, on labor rights. What does it mean to have a decent standard of living? What does it mean to have decent work? And those are the standards that you can use in a strategy to say, for instance, if you're a big firm, you need to have, let's say, various components included in your strategy. If you're smaller, let's say, microfinance firm focusing on female empowerment, then you need to not only say we are having inclusion and non-discrimination, but for instance, say what are the issues that touch women in the areas where we work, such as lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to education, and how do you actually then implement that? I was speaking to a firm just yesterday or this morning. I'm having so many meetings that I've forgotten. Who said that they don't really know where to start, and they have a supply chain. And I said, you know, there is an SDG which aims at getting better health, and there is a right to health. You have your supply chain somewhere where access to healthcare is very uncommon. And what you can do is you can have a doctor come in on your premises once a month and provide free healthcare. And all of a sudden you have actually taken a very concrete step, which doesn't necessarily require very much. So I think that there is a lot of awareness right now about what sustainability is, specifically on the environmental front. But I think that a lot of strategies are not necessarily very detailed or linked to things that then can subsequently be measured and reported upon.
Well, that's very interesting. And I would just have mentioned about using the SDG framework as a source of inspiration to go under the surface and see how along a supply chain, for instance, certain rights could be supported and protected for those that are affected by the business. Thank you, Kristina. Amanda, moving to you. Referring to your work at the United Nations Development Program on SDG Impact, your business is to target the gap between high-level principles and impact performance reporting. So I would like to know from you how far the Sdg Impact Initiative support impact investors in building robust sustainability strategies.
Thanks, Marianne and Kristina. I actually think I'll start from another bit of alphabet soup. So Kristina talked about ESG as part of that, the soup. And actually, through my work at the Impact Management Project, we observed similar things to what you did, Kristina, when looking at big organizations trying to do good, or at least talking about it. And there seemed to be an ABC emerging. So A was acting to avoid harm. So Kristina, to your point, like a lot of organizations are starting to say, this is bad for business, this is bad for customers, this is bad for the future of our planet, whether it was coming from a noble place or a very commercial mindset. There has been, and regulation, a lot of appetite to act to avoid harm. There is an opportunity to go further than that, and some were and are, which is to benefit all stakeholders. So not just act to avoid harm on all stakeholders, but generally benefit people in the planet. That includes your employees, your supply chain, looking at the environment as a key stakeholder, and of course your customers. And then the C was those who are going even further and contributing to solutions, contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals in a way that was observable, measurable, and reaching the most underserved people on the planet. And with that ABC in mind, I think we've come a long way in better understanding performance of enterprises and investors and across portfolios, right? Because we can start to look and ask the question of, if you're flying a flag about SDG 5 over here, are you making sure that you're acting to avoid harm to that SDG as well? And all SDGs, we need to see the Sustainable Development Goals. We need to make progress on them by 2030. So we want to hear as much about the real contributions that we're making as we want to hear that we're not holding them back, right? And so the act to avoid harm becomes sort of a precedent to talking about what your contribution is, and we need both. And so as that evolved over the past few years, Marianne, what you mentioned is that there's a difference between better understanding performance and asking the right questions about ABC and what enterprises and investors are doing towards the SDGs. And another, to make sure that's incorporated and embedded into practice. because there's never just a moment where you go, voila, we're achieving SDG 5, right? Checkbox, submitted, we'll come back to it in a few years. It's a constant process of learning and improving as we know more about our performance, good and bad. And so the UNDP Sdg Impact Initiative is basically complementing improved performance standards that are emerging around the world through the Impact Management Project and its structured network of standard setters, to say we also need, and the UN needs, a way to point to best practice when it comes to contributing to sustainable development goals, so that when any enterprise or investor comes to the UN around the SDGs, comes to a local country office, for example, and says, hey, I think these SDGs are a great idea. What am I supposed to do about getting there, whether they're just at the beginning of the journey or at the end of it? Could UNDP offer a set of practice standards to make sure that people are aware of that? So, so that's where we are with the UNDP Sdg Impact Program, a mix of standard development on practice that complements much better standards on performance that I hope we're getting closer to, and harmonization of what's already out there. There's also investor maps that are being launched at the country level to make sure that gaps on achieving the SDGs are being observed. And, you know, if we know that we're not doing enough in a certain country on a certain SDG, we should be encouraging capital and activity to go there. So that's another part. And then matchmaking between the many, the sort of growing ecosystem, whatever language they use, whatever part of the alphabet they know. I think the one thing the SDGs have done well is give us a palette of beautiful colors that if we do sort of a little more hard work, we can start to use those colors and say, this is the data behind them, this is what we're doing to achieve them, and we're not just ignoring the ones that we don't feel like talking about, but we're really considering all of the SDGs as sort of a roadmap for the future.
That's a nice metaphor that you just have used with the colors, because it has so many implications. I can see that we already have some questions in the chat, and that might allude to that metaphor. Renate, you had an eye on the questions that were coming in. Would you like to give the floor to one of the people in the audience that post their questions?
Exactly, thank you. I'm happy to do that. So I have a question from Deputy Deb. I think you are based in Munich. Would you like to ask your question? Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Renate. And you pronounced my name almost to perfection. Very rare situation to happen. But just call me DJ. I'm from Bosch Siemens Home Appliance, the SDGs are very important for us, and the whole concept is very important. But on the other hand, as we try to import and do innovation in this space, one of the challenges to really measure the impact of this. In case of normal business, the benefit is the impact is basically money, and you can measure it quite well. But in case of sustainable development goals, the impact is something that in context of measurement is still a challenge. So if you can give or enlighten us on this topic a bit.
So maybe this would be a great question for you, Amanda, to address first.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, although, Kristina, I'm sure you have many thoughts. I will just defer to the two things I just mentioned, actually. So, because it's a critical question. I mean, we can't talk about our contribution towards the SDGs if we're not clear on the kind of, one, practice we should be doing, and two, data on performance that we expect, right? And so I think the Impact Management Project for me personally is still a good reference for evolving measurement practice, what good measurement looks like. And if you go to that website, and I can put it in the chat, you'll see that there has been a consensus around needing to understand 5 dimensions of impact to really look at the effects of any activity or product or service. And the 5 dimensions are what, who, how much, contribution, and risk. I won't go through it all, but just to flag that the what is what outcomes the world needs. Positive outcomes that we're creating, or negative outcomes that need to be avoided. And that's exactly where the Sustainable Development Goals fit in. If we're clear on that what and those outcomes, then we can start to talk about data we have about who, is experiencing those outcomes, positive or negative, how much of a change they're experiencing, whether it's better or worse than what would likely happen anyway, and the risk that it doesn't go as we expect. The risk that we don't have the evidence or something goes wrong. So I think that would be my main point of reference for you on some of the best consensus on measurement that I'm seeing. And on behalf of the UNDP SDG Impact Program, that is being built on through the practice standards. So in the standards themselves, it's referencing this consensus as the best way to measure impact, although as these are practice standards, the UNDP will play no role in assuring the performance, simply the practice side of what you're doing to achieve the SDGs. I hope that's helpful. And Kristina, over to your wisdom as well.
Thank you. I don't know if it's going to be wisdom or rather even more confusing. I think, first of all, yes, we need to be able to report. And I think one really important thing for me is that we stop thinking that everything can be reported in an Excel sheet of numbers, or replying to fixed questions where we try to push all the information we have into a fixed scheme, and then what comes out on the other side is absolute nonsense. I can take from my my previous life, when finally the International Organization for Migration started to do results-based reporting. And since I work mostly on support to field officers on implementing human rights standards, advocacy with governments, it was a little bit difficult for me because a lot of people could report on how many people they had assisted who were victims of trafficking, on how many people they had harbored in shelters. And I was like, how the beep am I going to report on something that is this qualitative? So we came up with ways around it, such as, for instance, what were the processes we saw in policy development, how many, when we started thinking that something should be a frontline issue, with no meetings in the UN about these things, how could you see after 6 months that all of a sudden we were discussing these things? So it was a different way of going about saying this is actually a result. I think that when we talk about, for instance, a strategy, what I really want to see is that if you have, for instance, a supply chain, you are aware of the issues that you can encounter in that supply chain. For instance, lack of right to unionize, lack of right to have freedom of speech, lack of internal processes when you operate in countries where national legal systems are not going to support your workers, lack of inclusion of people with disabilities, if that's relevant for you, which sometimes it will be, or most times it will be, so that we realize that getting the data on a, let's say, a garment factory in the rural areas of Afghanistan, it's not necessarily going to be easy, but I would like us to at least see the first step, and that is being aware that we need to ask these questions. Mm-hmm. Because right now on the social in ESG, I think there's a lot of questions on the S that are going missing because people simply don't know that these are issues that we need to think about, and that can be pretty concrete. I mean, I just mentioned the right to healthcare. The right to healthcare, for instance, is also, if you want to address the adverse effects of corruption. As a private actor, unless you're very, very big, you will have a very hard time influencing corruption levels in the countries where you operate. If you're very big, you do have a role to play, but let's say you don't. One of the effects of corruption on people is that they have less access to healthcare unless they can pay bribes. If you actually have that doctor coming in an area that's rampant with corruption, you're also affecting or positively affecting the negative effects of corruption. That was a very bad sentence, but I've had very many meetings today, so I'm excusing myself for that. So I think that the first step really is to be able to say what is it that we're actually looking for answers to. And then also I think there's a lot of progress that have been made on measuring impact, positive, negative, on the environment, but which is not necessarily capturing the effects that any action on the environment has on the societal. If, for instance, a mining company sets up practices that ensure that they don't pollute water, that will be reported on SDG water. I have forgotten the number. What clean water actually means is better health. Children with better health has better education. better education leads to better possibilities for better work in the future, for better participation in society, for better political participation. That all links down to not being able to having clean drinking water or having clean drinking water.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't really think about those connections. A lot of people, I don't want to say everybody, but I think that that's also the things that when we start thinking outside of the Excel sheets with the text, we start seeing other connections. And that's something that I would really like to see. That's
interesting, Kristina. And that actually kind of draws to one question that we got from Roberto Bonino. Roberto, you've asked in the chat, do you consider B Corp certification as a solid evidence of an impactful sustainability strategy? And I think that kind of points to what you just said, Kristina, that if we are limiting ourselves to Excel sheets, we can't have a solid evidence base. So if I understand you correctly, you are advocating for going beyond that and asking these uncomfortable questions that we need to address if you want to understand impact in all its dimensions, not only positive, but as well the less positive, the negative impacts of our work.
I'm actually looking to one of the participants, Charlotte Horder, who is working on with B Corp. I think B Corp is actually really good practice. I don't think it's the only practice, and I don't think, like most of us, it does not have the answers to everything. I don't have the answers to everything. I wish I did. But I think that one of the things I really like about the B Corp certification is that it also looks at, for instance, what policies do you have in place? I just think that we need to see these things as what they are, and that is they are tools, such as the SDGs are not the best things since sliced bread. The SDGs are not going to save the world, but it's a tool towards guiding us, and that's why they're goals. Mm-hmm. Human rights, I've been preaching and practicing, I don't know if you can practice human rights for the past 20 years, and I've always said it's not an abracadabra that I go and I say, by the way, these standards exist and people will live happy lives. No, we need to put in the work, and we need to use the tools at our disposition. Mm-hmm. And I think that, for instance, B Corp questionnaires is a tool to be used together with others. Mm-hmm. I had a conversation with an asset manager based in Canada yesterday, who was, this goes back to the do no harm, who was a little bit worried about the reporting requirements that are going to come out from the EU on sustainable finance, because one of the things that they require is that you report that you're doing no harm. And they were like, how are we going to prove that? And they asked for my reading of it. And I said, well, my reading of that is exactly that. There has been a tendency to focus on your impact or your footprint on one thing. For instance, you provide or you produce solar panels, and automatically you're seen as being good. But producing solar panels might actually create an enormous amount of harm to the society you're doing that in, if you are doing it in Libya with Nigerian slave labor and anybody forgot to answer that question, or ask you that question, or if you're doing it in, let's say, in Kenya, but using all the water resources of surrounding villages, or you're doing it somewhere where people are depending on, for instance, nomadic tribes have their livestock grazing. So it's more about having more of a nuanced approach to, it's not just because you produce solar panels that you're good. You mm-hmm. can have a negative effect, and those need to be balanced. You can't necessarily be good on everything, but you do need to take into consideration that you do have potential negative or positive impacts. Just as the mining company who now in my theoretical world does not pollute the drinking water, is doing more than saving the local fauna and flora.
Thank you, Kristina. That was very enlightening. I'm looking at the time. I wanted to move to the next theme, but I think that the question that you, Tony, you posted in the chat is very important. So we kind of merge that. I hand over to Renate to moderate on that.
Tony, please feel free to ask your question and unmute yourself.
Hi there. Thank you, everybody, for the introduction, and Kristina and Amanda. Yeah, my question was, you mentioned, Amanda, about the contribution in measuring and reaching the most underserved on the planet. I just been observing that many of the Latin American, African and Asian countries, they sometimes don't have the reach and support that many other countries do. And especially I see such fantastic entrepreneurs, very capable, very technically competent, but they lack the opportunity. Is there anything you think we should be doing more, or corporates, global corporates should be doing more to be helping and supporting SDGs in those countries rather than just seeing them as you know, cheap outputs, access to minerals and resources and just cheap labor?
It's a really good question. And it's one of the reasons I'm enjoying the angle of the UN development program, right? Because that's their core stakeholders and all of those country offices in emerging and developing economies where there is an ecosystem under development, right? Where there is appetite, often from long-term family businesses or smaller SMEs up to the large corporates and investors in their respective countries and regions to do more locally. And I think what's interesting about that is the opportunity to help that happen while linking and syncing it, for lack of a better term, with what's happening with larger corporates and investors who also have an interest, maybe not, to your point, it's not getting there quick enough or as effectively for a lot of reasons we can debate, but also don't want to leave these more underserved regions on specific issues. Kristina brought up clean water and sanitation, right? We cannot ignore where scarce water resources are and are not, and who is benefiting or being harmed by decisions that we make by global multinational industry as much as local decisions. So I think it's a great question. I think it's a big opportunity that the UNDP sees to use its local resources more effectively and do trainings with their local country offices about a lot of the concepts we're talking about here and how they can support these organizations to embed that into better practice. I'll also just touch on the question of the B Lab and B Impact Assessment, because I think it's a great one for this purpose. What I like, I'm biased because I helped start B Lab UK, so just please take this with a grain of salt, but I'm very biased. I think that the B Impact Assessment as a public good is a really useful tool. You don't pay to use the B Impact Assessment and just sort of get a sense of where you are and whether you can answer the questions. It comes with resources and links to ways to do it without you paying. If you want to pay for certification, you can, but it's not a barrier to being able to learn and use this knowledge. So I think that's a really important feature of it. The other that might be interesting to people on the call is a collaboration that B Lab did with the UN Global Compact, and it's called the SDG Action Tracker. And what's nice about that is it's a very entry level, again, free to use resource that sort of says, are you generally avoiding harm to the SDGs? And here are the questions we're wondering. And depending on the SDGs that you're working on, what kind of questions matter about the SDG around water or on gender? And I think that that has helped converge two of the things we're talking about on this call, which is what does good look like, what is impact, and the SDGs, and making sure that we're asking better questions and starting to know what data we should be looking for, because that's often the hardest part. So I just wanted to offer those two resources to folks on the call, not to be, the B Impact Assessment isn't just about becoming a B Corp, although I think that has pros for a lot of companies who are keen to be a part of the community, but in itself is a really great resource that's constantly developed and updated by the team.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Kristina. That was, again, very rich. And I think that kind of covers well the question of regulations. Because when we talk about the ecosystem evolving around the private sector with its players and the power to actually change business as usual, we also need to look into how the ecosystem in terms of regulations is changing right now. And we can see that a lot of new regulations seem to be in the making. I remember in the prep call, Kristina, we were discussing a lot about that, both from the EU level as well as institutions, as the principles for responsible investment and investor initiative, which is the world's leading proponent of responsible investment. There's a lot happening there, and in less than 2 months from now, in March, so in a couple of weeks, the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation will actually start to apply. So lots of this is happening, and we can see that sustainable finance is more and more being integrated and pursued. And there is, as you say, an appetite and a new emerging area of finance. So my question would be, in this context, to what extent do you see players at risk if they don't want to be officially recognized as sustainable? Kristina, what's your perspective on that?
I think that definitely being non-sustainable is becoming a serious risk. It's becoming a serious risk not only because you will now risk getting huge fines by EU institutions, but it's also a naming and shaming exercise. It doesn't mean that if you want to be a signatory to the UNPRIs, I think they just for the very first time ever actually threw somebody out late last year, which means that they're beginning to actually take their role seriously and not just say, oh, we are a community for everybody who basically wants to sign up. But that's one thing. I think that what we see coming out at EU level, and also just the discussions that were going on in Switzerland about the Responsible Business Initiative, is showing that regulators are really onto this, and they realize, and I think, I've been in the public sector for 20 years, and I'm an international public law lawyer, so I'm not entirely sure what I think about this. But I think that there is a recognition of the fact that states alone are not going to be able to tackle the challenges that we face on human rights abuse, labor exploitation, the environment. For me, clearly, my entire training tells me that this is the responsibility of states. But at the end of the day, it's the responsibility of states to enact a legislation that obliges everybody else to follow these standards. And that's basically what they're doing. And I think that up until now, there was a presumption that the real players in this field would be state actors. And now we are all realizing that that's not it. I mean, I think that the Bill Gates Foundation and Bill Gates budget is what? It's like 100, if not 1,000 times bigger than WHO. So, I mean, clearly the private sector has an enormous role to play. And I think there's going to be a lot of pressure from consumers, from investor or asset owners once the millennials take over. I don't know how many billions once they inherit these many billions, because even if they all want their next or the newest iPhone, they also really want to see at least appear to be very sustainable. And this is something that's on their mind. And I think that regulators are really realizing that private funds, private money has an enormous role to play because of the power that they actually level. In some states, you will have enormous multinational companies who have actually more power than the state. And I think the consumers are realizing this. There will be consumer pressure, but there will also be state pressure to regularize this. What I think is interesting is that in order to actually really advance sustainability pragmatically, which is the only way to really advance it if you don't want to say that, okay, we're living up amongst the clouds while the earth is going to hell. That was kind of an interesting metaphor I came up with there. You do need to say you cannot let perfection be the enemy of good. It's just not, it's going to hurt people. And for instance, I think if we don't have a real engagement from the private sector, be it investors or companies with regulators, then we end up seeing regulation that is actually not practical. A very, let's say, banal, and I don't really want to say that it's banal because it's not, but an example is child labor. None of us want to see children work. We all know that it's horrible, shouldn't be done. We want to see children go to school, get an education, and play when they're not doing that. But in certain areas of the world, children either work or they get they get recruited into irregular armed forces. They get trafficked for sex exploitation. They are on the street. They starve or their families starve. Now, this is not nice. And none of us think it's nice, and we all think it shouldn't be like that, but reality is reality. So I think it's very, very important that we deal with the world as it is today and change it into what we would like to see it be, not only tomorrow, but in 10 years' time. So in those aspects, I think it's much more important to say we don't tell companies that we defund them or we divest. The moment they do their due diligence, I find out that they have child labor in their supply chain. We defund them and divest if they don't do something about it. but what is it that they can do about it? Because if we have regulation in place where the only thing they can do is pull out of those areas and just let somebody who's not regulated come in and abuse these children, harm the kids. What we really need to do is to have a dialogue and say, okay, in this area of the world, shit is happening. That's a very well-known legal term. So what is it as a company that we can do? We can make certain that very young children in 3 months do not work. Okay, that's one thing. But we can also set programs in place so that there are very strict regulations on what can children do, how many hours can they work, and how can we engage with the local community to create alternatives to support schooling. And for the children, well, for the young people who are older, how can we transform our work into vocational training so that they come out with a trade? Because otherwise you will just oblige companies to pull out of difficult areas of the world where, I'm sorry to say this, and I'm sure they are listening in, the Chinese are ready to go in and they are not regulated. So I think it's also a question of saying we want to do better for people who have no voice. And we cannot let the fact that we think that certain conditions are unacceptable blind us to the fact that we can help children or anybody who is, I mean, this is, I mean, that's an example because it touches people's cause, but it's also true that we have sweatshops in the US where adults are sitting in diapers sewing our t-shirts because they're not allowed to have a toilet break in a 10 or 12 hour day, and where they cannot escape because everything is locked down and blocked, and if a fire breaks out, well, they're dead. So I think that's a question of saying what is reality and what are the steps we need to take to really work towards the world we want, instead of just putting on blinders and say if things are not perfect, then we don't want them.
Thank you, Kristina. You kind of your key message was we should stay future oriented rather than looking always back and trying to bash those that have not worked accordingly to how we envision the future. So thank you for that. And that kind of points to the comment that John Granholm made in the chat box, and as well I can see that we have a certain agreement that only if we have the right players in power that would support rising regulations to build up an ecosystem in the future that does not allow those abuses, only then we are able to really work towards sustainable development goals as we have put them in place. Amanda, you working at the UNDP, you not only focus on impact standards for enterprises, you also address standards for private equity and for private equity funds and for bonds. How does the UNDP approach support the implementation of a rising regulations? As you have the global picture, you're not only focusing on the European region, for instance, but you have, for instance, as you said, the global South as one of the emerging regions in focus.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's echoing what Kristina was saying about a bias towards action and recognizing that the UNDP in all of its local context would be trying to see change to achieve the SDGs from a policy perspective, but that there's proactive private capital also available that's willing to take action now and not wait for regulation first. And so as you say, I think it's critical. I think it's coming. I think it's in the best interest of public and private sectors to raise the bar. And I think a lot of private activity is happening, recognizing that that's the likely scenario for where we head next. But I think, as you mentioned, for the standards, for the market mapping that's happening, and for sort of training of country offices, it's just a chance to say, if regulation's not there yet, it doesn't mean that we don't do this. We don't have time to waste. And if we can focus on what good practices we can make now towards achieving the SDGs around governance of our organizations, transparency, right? What is good management? This is all going to make one, prepare organizations for regulation to come, if you want to think of it that way, and or just get us closer to achieving the SDGs, whether regulation comes through or not.
Thank you, Amanda. I think we can move to the last theme, because it kind of builds on what we discussed now, and this is about the role of impact investment. So Amanda, over to you again. You have focused your career on shaping social innovation and investment strategy with corporates and entrepreneurs. And in an article last year for a magazine called Responsible Investor, you argued that investors must engage on new forms of stakeholder capitalism. I found that quite interesting, that approach. And you advocated that stronger ESG impact analysis at the investment structure need to be deployed. Where do we stand today when it comes to mitigating systemic risks for a sustainable future with the help of an integrated approach? And then here I'm again alluding to investment.
Great question. It brings together a few other strands of work that I think are really critical, but it does all come back to that ABC I talked about in the beginning. I think with the rise of impact investing, we have seen more conversation about how investing can drive positive social and environmental outcomes, which is fantastic, right? It's sort of showing it's possible, showing a correlation with financial returns, that sometimes you can choose to invest in things that won't give you a market rate financial return, but you can also invest in things that are good for the world and achieve financial return, right? Like we have options here. There's no default mode where we have to be horrible. And so I think impact investing has created the space for a bigger conversation around what our money can do. At the same time, I think for about at least a decade, I welcome other people's sense of timing, impact investing was only incentivized really to talk about the good it was doing. And so you would have, the launch of new, and we still do, large private equity structures that are impact investing, right? But we're not talking about, for example, the underlying structures of our investments and whether they're causing negative impact just by the nature of the financing itself. For example, with private equity, especially in the US, it's becoming a hot topic that a lot of times those workers and those lower in sort of the value chain of a company are working very hard for very low uncertain pay. They're keeping sort of the engines of these companies going, but we have a 2 and 20 model at the top of private equity, which is capturing a lot of that value, right? And so are those workers being compensated fairly for the value they create and the risk they take? That's a core question that's not just about impact investing, right? And it's not going to be solved by impact investing if we're saying we're just focusing on the good of finance. We have to also look at the structural nature of finance and the tools we use and make sure that it's avoiding harm as much as it's contributing to solutions. So that's sort of the context, Marianne, of that article in Responsible Investor last year. I think it's the elephant in the room when we look at investing in the SDGs and investing in impact, and it's on all of us to sort of be asking better questions about this. And I think it's increasingly, we hope, and through some work I'm doing with the pre-distribution initiative, being incorporated into how asset owners are vetting managers and making sure that over time, we're not forgetting big parts of our economy, and especially sort of environmental degradation as well, as we pursue financial return, even if it's trying to embed more ESG and impact in the process. I'll pause there.
Okay, thank you, Amanda. That was fantastic. I can see, I'm following beside the chat box, and I can see that Charlotte Horder, you have been quite active in posting, and I just wanted to come back for a comment that you made when we talked about the other theme before, and you were saying, you were alluding to the concept of continuously learning and improving. And I like that you have mentioned that, because it seems that given the complexity that we are facing right now, we need to keep up that willingness that mistakes are made, but we need this future-oriented approach to learn from what has not worked in the past and try to reach out to new players and then taking on new roles that we have not been taking before. So thank you, Charlotte. Just wanted to make the comment that you enriched the discussion in the chat box. And Kristina, moving to you now, what does it take, in your opinion, to advance in the sustainability space as an investor? So clearly, it is partially to recognize not only the regulations that are out there, but again, to be innovative and to look into a human rights-based approach, but also into how a return on investment and impact are leveraging each other. You said we need to invest in the hard sectors to actually make a difference. What does it take to do so?
Oh, you're sort of ending the evening on a really light and easy question, aren't you? Okay, thank you so much for putting me on that particular spot. So first of all, I think I really want to start out by echoing something that Amanda also said. Now, by all means, prefacing this, I am all for impact investment. I think impact investment has an amazing role to play, but I think it is very important that we look more systematically at how should any investment be sustainable, in the sense, and also in the sense that any investment will have an impact, and it's not necessarily good and it's not necessarily huge, but to say, look, if you decide to invest in a extraction company, I think that that's actually, first of all, it's structurally very big. Mm-hmm. It opens up investment portfolios for a number of ESG investors or sustainable investors who are right now trying to avoid that because they see it as dangerous, as something that they will get criticized for. At the same time, we're all sitting here on our computers and our laptops and our iPhones, our Samsungs and whatever it is. And well, lo and behold, there are minerals in those. And if we don't have mines, we won't have all of this. So it's not something we can just close our eyes to. Now, please don't go invest in arms, right? I mean, no, that will probably be very hard for me to justify as being sustainable. But the extraction industry, the garment industry, because for instance, everybody will say, oh, the extraction industry is bad. The garment industry is bloody awful, but nobody really realizes that and talks about it. So I think it's about saying, first of all, it will take small steps to massively change a lot of people's lives. If you invest not only in smaller projects, if you don't only do impact investment, but you say, let me invest in cobalt mines in DRC, but with conditions. And I engage somebody to actually go and make independent verifications. Not that everything is going to be okay from today to tomorrow, but that there's a real engagement on the part of the mining company that they want to improve conditions, both environmentally as well as socially, that they engage in, that they have a real engagement with civil society and not only with the local armed groups. If then we set up really sort of concrete medium and long-term goals, we need also to go and see if those goals were not fulfilled, what happened. Cobalt industry in DRC, it is possible that somebody was pointing a machine gun at you for the past 6 months. That's a valid excuse. If you simply just let things go and deteriorate, that's not a valid excuse, then we're going to divest. Mm-hmm. But the same thing is valid for the garment industry, where our t-shirts are being produced in sweatshops. So I think it's all about having an engagement and saying it takes not that much to actually massively change people's lives around the world. And if you do so, you all of a sudden also create a pressure on states that are not necessarily doing very well on, for instance, political engagement, because if you treat people well, if they're fed and if they're healthy, they start engaging politically. They start demanding their rights, and then they might also, if they have a decent standard of living and a decent salary, start buying your products. So all of a sudden, you're actually creating a market. And in the market that you're already catering to, if you're, for instance, a t-shirt producer, that's not a word, but anyhow, somebody who makes t-shirts that you're selling basically in the EU, if it comes out that you're having a discourse around sustainability, which almost everybody is these days, but you're actually massively violating rights, you will be slammed in social media. So I'm also thinking that the simple fact that everybody these days are either green or white or blue or yellow washing or whatever it is that they're washing, we can criticize them, and we should criticize them if they're not taking concrete steps. But for me, I mean, I remember 20 past years ago, God, well, yeah, I do, when a number of countries still felt quite comfortable saying that human rights were not something they were interested in. That changed about 2 decades ago, and all of a sudden all countries were very into not violating their human rights. They still did it, but they found discourses around it.
Yeah.
That itself was a sign that nobody could get away with not taking this seriously anymore. So all the green, blue, yellow, and pink washing that's going on, it's not good, but it is a sign that everybody is realizing that they can't just ignore this anymore. And the more they speak, the more we can hold them accountable.
Wow, very good. I would like to ask Roberto Bonino to ask your question. You have an important one. Please, Roberto, you have the floor.
Yes, my question is about how to ensure continuity of impact investment, even when a successful, impactful company is acquired through mergers and acquisition. And as Charlotte is pointing out, B Corp certification imposes changes in the legal statutes that guarantee that, but that's not for everybody. So do you have other options, ideas on how to do that?
Amanda?
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the most important questions of our time, especially as the M&A industry just feels like, and corporate consolidation is going wild. We, in the impact investing world, despite everything Kristina and I just said, do think about this a lot, right? Because you don't want to be spending and engaging with companies to achieve success that on the day of sale just like disappears. And some of you might know the story of why B Lab started, which was that its founders started a very popular sportswear brand in the US. They did an incredible company with a lot of value, right? Both values around their people, their culture, and value to the point where they were selling. And they had to, by law, sell to the highest bidder. They couldn't choose a lower bid, even if it matched their values and had a greater likelihood, let's say, of impact being kept in the organization. And so that is exactly why B Lab started. They are taking a step, if you are a B Corp, where you change your articles to allow founders to have that choice. I think that's one approach, is to be able to say you are allowed to choose impact on your company and on your products as a part of who you sell to and why. And I think from the investor perspective, we are looking at details and term sheets now with companies that we invest in, and also with who we sell to. I'm seeing it in a lot of venture funds and private equity vehicles to make sure that the reasons and impacts on all stakeholders that have been optimized over the course of our holding are kept into the future as much as we can control. This, however, is not a science yet. It's not, I think, commonly done, and I think there's still a lot of room to grow on this exit strategy. And the mission lock is often how I hear it being called. Sort of, how do we lock in mission of these organizations over time? So, great question, and I hope that we can all find more ways to do that in the future.
I want to thank you, Amanda, and as well you, Kristina. As you can see, we are almost at the end of our 60 minutes session. So thank you so much for this incredibly rich facets of what it means to go beyond ESG standards. And I would like to ask you now for a short final statement addressing your key message to our community. Can be one sentence you want to share. Kristina, would you like to go first?
Oh gosh, that's not the sentence. I would say use international standards to make small steps towards the world you'd like to see tomorrow and recognize the world you live in today.
Fantastic.
And I think we're past the time where we can choose our favorite SDG and talk about that one. I think what you've heard us all say is we need to think about the Sustainable Development Goals as that roadmap for our future, and do as little harm or hold them back as little as we can and do as much good as possible in all of our activities.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you. So clearly the rapid availability of data will come to the equation, but I think we should not be over impressed by the complexity that we are facing, and we need to keep our agency and move ahead. So wrapping up our session today, a warm thank you to you speakers again, and as well to the audience. Thank you for your participation and your comments and questions that you posted or addressed yourself with the mic. So we are back on air a few weeks from now with another online talk on Wednesday, February the 3rd. Please follow us on social media for further information. Also, for those who are interested in our work on Geneva Impact, this initiative that I've mentioned at the beginning, we are hosting a design thinking workshop next week on Tuesday, January 19th, moderated by Professor Morin from the University of Geneva. We will kickstart there our community-driven process to co-create a first round of impact project. So if you're interested, please contact us and drop us a line and just put into the chat the email address. So we are happy to send you more information on that. And yeah, being 1 minute late, I thank you all for this great discussion today and wish you a great rest of the week. Thank you for impacting together, and we hope that we can reconnect very soon with you. You can see on the slide our different channels. And for now, have a good week and au revoir. Goodbye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.